I hope everyone's here to get some value and to enjoy today's MPC live events. It's a lot of fun for us to put these together, and it's certainly a privilege to have extremely experienced professionals with us in general, and especially today. As we all know, these events, these MPC live events, are trying to illustrate certain points, certain interesting discussion topics. And today we're talking about the CISO versus the CPO and whether they can coexist. It's an interesting point, but before we go there, I wanted to illustrate the fact that the Knowledge Flow Foundation is putting on these events. It's hosting them as an unbiased party, and we've got Managed Privacy Canada as the chief sponsor of the event. Our panelists today, as you can see their images there, are here with us from a variety of different backgrounds, and certainly they're going to be instrumental in discussing the I want to say the peculiarities of the differences between the CISO and the CPO roles. But before further ado, I wanted to introduce first of all Amalia Barthel, who is representing Managed Privacy Canada. She is a seasoned privacy professional. She is certainly a cybersecurity champion, and she has more certifications after her name than I've seen in a long time. She is fantastic. And Amalia, if you have something to add, totally fine. But I'm just going to go through and introduce our next two panelists. I'm not seeing Carlos,
yeah,
but if he's joining, then I'm going to introduce him as
Rosario.
well. For now,
maybe skip.
For now, we'll go with Rosario. Rosario, you are the Chief Privacy and Legal Officer at ICES, not ISIS, but ICES.
ICES.
That's right. Spelling is important, and it's Ontario's largest health services research and analytic data institute and steward of data, which makes you a particularly great person to talk to today. So I'm glad that you're with us. I'm glad that you typically participate in speaking engagements, and that you have a master's in science, and of course that that you were practicing law previously at Faskins. So moving on to our friend Pekka. Pekka, if you get any sort of choppy or delays from Pekka, it's because he comes in from far away, and he's from Finland. He's connecting from Finland. Thank you, Pekka. At some ungodly hour, I think, or he's skipping dinner at least for us. No, he hasn't skipped dinner. Pekka is the co-founder and business director of Privacy Ant. It's an organization that has built a really cool privacy management platform. Their software enables organizations to get data protection and privacy managed by visualizing data flows, systematizing compliance and assessments. So we like the tool. We certainly were interested in having a chat with one of the founders of the company, and we're glad to have you here today. And
we can introduce Carlos. He's joining.
Carlos is joining imminently, so we might as well. Carlos actually started at ENY what seems like 3 decades ago, and now he's back at ENY.
He was 5 years old, yes.
And, he's got more than 24 years of experience, and he's worked all over America, Europe, and Asia. So yeah, it was very interesting because we've worked with him for years, and especially Amalia, you teach at U of T with Carlos. So he's a great guy. He is a champion of security and privacy, and we're happy to have him with us today as soon as he connects. Anything to add? Did I miss anything? Any details?
No.
I think we're good.
No, we can go.
I think we're awesome. So just to again to go ahead with this introduction, we know that global privacy laws change. We know that the authority of the watchdogs that we see in each country is more or less focused on cybersecurity and more or less focused on data protection. We see a lot of key principles, and those key principles have to trickle down to organizations. And the way that, concepts like accountability, for example, trickle down to private companies differs by orders of magnitude, in particular because there are such things as culture clashes, not just between countries, but between organizations, even within the same sector. So we see a lot of variety in the way that the leadership roles taken by chief security officers differ from those of people in charge of privacy, most notably chief privacy officers, or even data privacy officers or data protection officers. So we wanted to get this discussion going, and Amalia and I were talking about whether to position this as more of a discussion about the two roles. And I thought, well, Versus, I think, captures it really well, because we are talking about two roles that in some cases are siloed. In some cases, they meet so rarely as to say, well, are they actually sharing sufficient amounts of data that would make data protection and compliance actionable, or perhaps they're not meeting enough and their compliance posture might be at risk as a result. So that's the preamble. We thought we would take this unique opportunity to have this discussion, and we wanted to show some balance. All of us here have had experience. Our esteemed panel has seen a ton of situations, and I wanted to get some of that value out to our audience. So as usual with our events, it's split into 4 parts. Our 4 parts are very simple. How did we get here? Part 2 is a discussion of whether this is a transitional time, or is this the best that we can do as far as the dynamics between the CISOs and the CPOs. In part 3, we talk about what can go wrong, what kinds of disconnects we see, and certainly that's not limited to part 3, but that's the part that we dedicated to it. And then part 4, how can we improve the situation if indeed there are opportunities for improvement? So without further ado, I'm going to throw us all in there, because we want to get going with part 1. We want to talk about potentially a little bit about what everyone understands to be not so much the definitions of each, but the delta. Where do they overlap and where do they differ? So when I know that, for example, you, Pekka, when you're in contact with clients, both potential clients and clients that you've had for years, and when you talk about data protection, you often have to pick up information from people responsible for security and for privacy. How do you see the differences between those roles, and how do they coalesce? And feel free to talk about this across borders, because that's of interest as well. Give us a 2-minute spiel about that, and then we'll move on to Rosario.
Yes, well, obviously, as a software entrepreneur, we have to get in contact with potential clients, and quite often the most common role is the data protection officer that we try to find, but it is not uncommon that it is the chief information security officer that is also there. And quite often they also have this dual role that companies see quite natural, that the same person who is the CISO will also be appointed as the DPO. which is not in the spirit of the GDPR if we take a look at the regulation. But how do they differ? From my experience, the CISOs are maybe more into the technical side of information security, whereas the DPOs are more concerned about whether the compliance documentation have been compiled up in a good manner, appropriate manner, and whether the legal requirements have been met. Mm-hmm. So it to me it has been more about the data protection officers being concerned about the legality of the things, and less about the technicalities, although data protection officer is very much in the realm of ICT and related processes, whereas CISO is more about the securing the information assets in a technical and organizational measures. So that's in a 2-minute short idea what I have seen so far.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I always see compliance as being the great equalizer. It always comes down to, well, you know what do we absolutely have to do? It's unfortunate sometimes that that's what it comes down to. But as you can see, one of the points I wanted to discuss is related to the common language, the terminology. That oftentimes the disconnect comes down to literally people not understanding each other, because some speak at the compliance language of privacy and others talk about information security controls. Rosario, you've both participated in these kinds of discussions in organizations between these kinds of roles, but also in different countries, in different languages. So tell us about a little bit about the challenges of establishing a common language between these roles.
Sure. And so in my experience, it is a little bit unique in that when I first started at ICS, cybersecurity was aligned primarily with the information technology department. And soon after I started, in fact, I gained responsibility for cybersecurity in addition to privacy and legal. So because although I'm Chief Privacy and Legal Officer, I oversee 2 departments, the Privacy and Legal Office on the one hand, and the cybersecurity department on the other hand. And I find from my perspective that this actually works quite well. And the reason for that is because the way in which we operate, so ICS is an institution, as you mentioned, that collects and uses personal health information of all Ontarians. And so we function very much based on the data life cycle in terms of how we operationalize our policies, our procedures, our practices. And so from the outset, from the beginning, if we're looking at, does ICS have lawful authority to collect and use? That's really privacy who comes in to make that assessment. Does the collection fall under what statute does it fall under? And they conduct the analysis and so forth. And then legal comes in and ensures once there is authority to collect and use the personal health information, legal will typically then get involved and sort of in paper the transaction, if you will, between the party that's disclosing the information and the party ICS that is receiving or collecting the information. And so their role is primarily in respect of contracts. But then subsequent to that, we have cybersecurity, who's really at if you can say, at the front end, ensuring that we have secure transfer. And further, once the data arrives, that, in terms of retention, do we have the physical safeguards? Do we have the technical safeguards? In addition to, of course, all of the administrative safeguards that need to happen. And following that, so you can see that there's privacy, legal, and cybersecurity is compliance, which again goes back to, privacy and legal in that particular group to ensure that all the practices from the beginning to the end of that particular life cycle are in compliance with with our statute that we're subject to, with the requirements from the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, which oversees our practices, and as well that that we follow through on NIST related requirements, because that's a framework that we've undertaken. So if you can see from the particular model that I just outlined, it's very much a model where we have to work as an integrated team in order to ensure that we minimize any risks that may have been identified in respect of any of these points along the way.
Awesome.
It was a little bit more than 2 minutes, but
no, but that's fascinating, and I agree entirely. And again, compliance.
yes, exactly.
Carlos, welcome. It's awesome to see you. I hope you can
Hello.
see us. I think you jumped in at the exact perfect time. We wanted to talk about, to build on what Pekka said and what Rosario added to. It comes down to compliance, but it's also a matter of responsibility and accountability. How do you see that balance between the CISO and the CPO roles?
Hello, everyone. And yes, I can see you. And I have to apologize. I'm just fresh from the airport, coming from Mexico City in a trip that was a little bit unexpected, but everything is going well. So I think I have to thank you. I have to get aligned with Rosario and Pekka on how they are seeing things. I think that what I have seen with different clients and in different countries is that we have a professional within the cybersecurity space that is more aligned with information technology, more aligned to engineering, I will say, and someone within the privacy side that is more aligned to the legal side of things and the compliance side of things. In the majority of cases of organizations I have been working with, I see two separate entities in many times working in isolation. I think the next step for the two of them is precisely to have this cooperation and this support and this collaboration that everyone needs so that the organization can be amalgamated and deliver what the value, what the businesses are expecting from the value perspective. But I think that perhaps the academic background and the responsibilities we have in each one of these sites, the ones that are pushing them to be working in this isolation. But I definitely see the two of these functions working together in this evolution we are looking for. There's no way we can have a solid privacy function if we don't have a solid cybersecurity function. Unfortunately, I think that many organizations are not there yet.
I agree. And as it happens, and I love the fact that we have such a panel with such diverse experience, a global experience. Amalia, I wonder if you wouldn't mind touching a little bit upon some of the pivotal moments in privacy in particular, but also security perhaps, that served to bring the privacy function to where it's at, in particular here in Canada, where we've seen an evolution of the CPO role. And now more recently, we're seeing it driven by, again, global compliance, by DPO responsibilities, by the way the CISO jockeys for position. What are your thoughts?
So I do agree with everything that's been said. In the early 2000s, the biggest and Carlos and I were teaching this in the cybersecurity and IT risk management course at U of T. The biggest legislation that has influenced the Canadian market was the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, and that is when IT came to their realization that they actually have to prove compliance. It was quite security focused. Privacy wasn't because it was about financial results. But slowly, privacy became an interest from big organizations as a risk. So privacy was shoved under risk management, which is great to begin with. Later on, legislation has evolved, and in particular, we're talking about the GDPR. And GDPR carved out this role called the DPO, the Data Protection Officer. It's not privacy, it's protection. And it's because Convention 108, and it's because the fundamental human rights in Europe that are all about the rights of the individual to know what is collected, to remain private with their information and so on. But the role of the DPO, just as a little point of history, was when the GDPR was enacted and was discussed, it was about not just taking the burden off the regulators and moving it to the organizations. But it was a step in maturity. It was to make organizations accountable. And therefore, a certain criteria was enabled to appoint a DPO, which is kind of the watchdog from the legislation perspective. It's like a dotted line representative of the regulator, if you like. However, a lot of big organizations that I've worked with and we've seen, Carlos, also have a CPO. So that's the internal role, the Chief Privacy Officer. And the internal role is exactly what Rosario's. Rosario's role is very unique and very exciting because Rosario is also kind of has an eye over to the regulator as well. But in an organization, let's say like a private sector organization, typically a big bank, they have a CPO, and the CPO is appointed to enable compliance with the regulation, but also to enable business to happen. And I want to emphasize a lot the fact that the internal role is also an advocate for the business. That doesn't mean that they will close an eye or two at certain ways in which data is being processed. No, but they have to be the shepherd. They have to actually work with the business, walk them through. So these are some of the roles and responsibilities historically.
And that sounds like we're heading towards another particular word, and that is authority. And the authority or the empowerment of these roles within organizations can change as far as we've certainly seen it. With respect to the fact that we said originally CISO versus CPO, and again, not meaning to stir up trouble, but I want in two quick words, I want, or one sentence, I want each one of you to tell me whether you think that perhaps in Canada or in Finland or in any other particular country, the CISO role is more mature than the CPO role. And by maturity, we mean, where is it heading? Is it there now? Is it at the right authority level? Is it empowered to do what it should be doing? So for example, Amalia, since you just spoke, why don't you tell us what you think about the balance between the maturity of those roles here in Canada versus perhaps around the world?
I think it's more of a divide between North America and Europe, and also startups versus more developed organizations or mid-market. I do see, and I'm actually very glad to see. I know we always say you cannot have privacy without security, but you can have security without privacy. I'm really glad that security is, in my opinion, more developed because I think it took a very long time for security to get to the table and to say it's important for data to be protected. It's important. And this is another bit of a common language or common language that divides the two continents. What we understand in North America as data protection is actually security. What they understand in Europe is the fundamental rights of privacy rights. That's what data protection is. It encompasses security safeguards.
Thank you.
But sorry, just quickly, I don't want to belabor the point, but I wanted to say that the security function seems to be more developed, at least in North America.
Pekka, do you agree?
I completely agree. It has a longer history, the CISO role and the whole function of information security. You have the ISO 27001 standards all the way from the 90s. When I contact organizations, usually the CISOs, they do have budgets, but still data protection and privacy are in their infancy, maybe getting to their teenage at the moment. So after like 4 years of the implementation or enforcement of the GDPR, we have starting to witness some organizations having like assigned budget for DPOs and chief privacy officers, but still it's the CISOs that do have the shoulders and the muscles in companies, and so do the CIOs. Well, the that are handling and managing the information assets. So I hope in this decade, at least, privacy and data protection will gain a bigger role and having greater access to the top management of organization. There's still a lot of work to be done.
Excellent. Rosario.
So I do agree, though I have a nuance to add to this. I would say that within, at least in Ontario, with respect to the health sector, there tends to be quite a mature privacy a framework and presence. And I think it's really as a result of the fact that, we have an information privacy commissioner that is engaged and that sets expectations and quite, a pretty high bar. And so whereas on the security side, you have NIST and you have other frameworks and you have ISO 27001, 27001 and so forth. On the privacy side in Ontario, at the very least, with respect to the organization that I work at, which is called a prescribed entity, we have a manual that we have to follow. And this manual that we have to follow is very prescriptive in respect of privacy related requirements. And so I think there's that nuance there in the health sector, though I will say that I think, certainly over the past few years, because of threats, cyber security related threats across the world globally, I think when it comes to cybersecurity, there is so much more of that. As you mentioned, I think it was you, Claudia, or maybe you, Pekka, that talked about, kind of the shoulders and the budgets and, the investment that's going into cybersecurity right now, because it's the perception and the threat actors are quite big. I will say, just in closing on this particular point, that I work very closely with our Public Advisory Council at ICS to advise us on how we're communicating our privacy and security program to the public, because ultimately, as you mentioned, we're a trusted steward of their data, and it's very important, that we're transparent in our practices. And I asked them, what do you think of the language that we currently have on our website? Their feedback to me was, it's great that you have lawful authority to collect and use and disclose. That's all great in the legislation, but what are you doing to protect my data? Because from a cybersecurity perspective, that's really, what the public wanted to know. So I always take that into consideration, when we're looking at our practices more generally. I will say that when it comes to accountability, I do report quarterly to our board of directors and to our finance, audit, and risk committee of the board. And I do provide a written report on where our maturity levels are, both in respect of privacy and security. So, from that perspective, I suppose the board has a good understanding of where we're at.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yes.
One short thing I would add, I'd only add that we do have in Finland and Europe in general also, the teleoperators have had a longer history in having a stronger position of the privacy professionals in organization. I would say, for example, in Finland, the teleoperators have their own data protection and privacy teams. They have the budgets. The DPO really has an independent role. So I could say it's industry dependent. Also, as Rosario said, also Finland has a long history of having in the healthcare sector data protection officer and privacy professionals. So it is, you would say it's industry specific.
So Carlos, what do you think the answer is? It depends.
Yeah, you know me. No, I think it is pretty interesting, and I think that one specific ingredient that is pushing for the development of the function on either side is regulation or authority. The way Rosario was describing it is pretty interesting, and what Pekka was just punctualizing is pretty important as well. I think that over time, the chief privacy officer or the privacy officer has gained a very well vertical development that is in the majority of cases focused on compliance. I love what I have seen with Rosario and some very mature clients that are expanding and being more horizontal in what they are doing in privacy and really linking with cybersecurity, but that's not very common. On the other side, I have seen the cybersecurity function maturing more horizontally. It's not only finding a way to do what they have to do within their fields of play, they have started growing horizontally to develop relationships with the rest of the organization. They have been evolving more in a risk reduction function, while privacy is evolving in a more compliance function. And I think that what the two of them need to do is to try to identify how to start generating value in order to deliver to the business what the business is expecting. Now, this value generation in the case of the two of these functions, I think it is completely related to trust. How is it that they are going to be working together to give back trust to the multiple stakeholders they are working with? Something that has been very unique in the case of the two functions, but I think that the cybersecurity function has been more on the field on these, is cybersecurity incidents. We know that cybersecurity incidents are there all over the world, and this has given many organizations the idea of having to develop a cybersecurity function to avoid being the ones that are going to be going through these type of challenges. But again, I see the privacy function developing more vertically, while the cybersecurity function is developing more horizontally. And I think that the two of them need to do something similar in order to get together and have a developed function that is going to be more inclined to value generation.
I agree that, so I remember even a couple of decades ago when I was speaking with executives and they continued to see anything to do with data protection or security, or privacy as a cost center. And they always came back and said, where's the ROI? I mean, you're asking us to spend money on this stuff, but where's the ROI? Because you can't prove that there are any breaches taking place here, at least here in Canada. And that's why I've been such an ardent proponent of breach notification law since before PIPEDA came out.
And Claudio, sorry, just to close that and just bringing this in alignment to what Pekka said, we started seeing frameworks, operational frameworks, I will say, more in cybersecurity, like the NIST cybersecurity framework and ISO 27001. And it is pretty interesting to see now that these two frameworks that are leading the way in the cybersecurity space, having their counterparts in privacy. So now we have a NIST privacy framework connected to the cybersecurity one, and we have ISO 27701 connected to ISO 27001. So I think that is marking an evolution as well and trying to bring the two of these pieces together.
Sure is. And you see this evolution happening across the board. For example, PCI DSS 4.0 is coming out with additional focus on data protection and the protection of personal information and so on. So I tend to agree. And again, there's this path that we're noticing from compliance to authority to value. Right. These are key words that are sticking, at least in my mind. And as we progress, and certainly as we progress through the hour, we're now in our second section. I want to talk about all three of these important topics. How are we going to modernize privacy so that, one, it catches up with the degree of measurability that security has enjoyed ever since Sarbanes-Oxley, for example? How are we going to get to that level of modernization? And will it take more than just the CPO? What do you think, Rosario? Or sorry, Amalia.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I was thinking so many thoughts about this. Well, I love that in the last decade, we're seeing a lot of overlaps between privacy and security. Carlos talked about breaches. That is one overlap. Of course, training. And I think working together with the security team, the threat and risk assessments. So some of us, and Rosario will probably say the same thing, we look at what security is telling us as far as what are the vulnerabilities, the risks out there, and then we start protecting and looking at our privacy compliance program and seeing if we're missing anything, if we need to add some things. So I think both roles have their own unique importance, but I believe that there has to be recognition that a CPO cannot do the entire CISO role or vice versa.
Rosario, what do you think?
So I'd say two things came to mind as you were speaking, and also what Amalia said, just to reiterate. So I think one, what we are starting to do at ICS is look at privacy with the view of focusing on controls. The controls that we have, just like we have cybersecurity controls in place, like through NIST and so forth, we also are looking at privacy in our program through controls so that we can actually measure improvements in our privacy program from that perspective. The other area where we're really maturing is on our enterprise risk management program, because risks are identified, either the privacy risks, for example, or cybersecurity risks, in addition to, of course, other organizational risks that may arise outside of both privacy and cyber, and to some extent legal. But having that particular perspective, I have found, has allowed us to better align cybersecurity and privacy, because oftentimes the mitigation plan that you have to implement to address the particular risk that you have identified and assessed requires both privacy to some extent and cybersecurity to work jointly together with the business to achieve a particular result. So I'd say, from my perspective, modernized privacy will focus more so on controls, as well as taking a better look at the enterprise risk management program of an organization and how that can bridge the two areas together.
I love it. I love that idea of alignment. Pekka, do you think alignment is invariably going to require the help of technology?
Alignment, yes, you could say so. That, as we know, that ICT, I mean, the technology of information and communication technology is advancing so fast that it's hard to keep up for any function or business function, and especially the information security professionals, how to implement those controls and keep up with the latest cyber threats out there will demand a lot of that the staff, cybersecurity and information security staff, will keep up their capabilities and proficiency to protect the data, but also for privacy professionals to be able to monitor the situation, because it's getting there. I would say that as the threat climate has been risen since the COVID started back into 2 years ago, I saw a surge of privacy, interest towards privacy coming from the cybersecurity threats that were surging up. And now with the latest geopolitical conflict, that especially here in Finland, there is this situation that our national security agencies actually warning citizens and companies that there is now a higher threat in the coming months of cyber security attacks. Well, that will also affect privacy professionals, because they will have to make sure that the databases and the IT system will be protected against malignant attacks from abroad. Business data and ability to have the business processes of hospitals and government agencies run, but also protecting people's personal data, because it could be a national security threat if, for example, people's sensitive data would be out there in the dark net in the coming months. That could have devastating effects on society as well. So they are converging, and their technology has a very important role in protecting the business interests, but also their privacy interests and human rights of European people, or any people for that matter.
Yeah, fantastic. Carlos, what are your thoughts about that further alignment, and will that alignment necessarily require that comparison between the CPO and the CISO role from a value delivery perspective, right? Because at the end of the day, it's one thing to understand the value delivery, it's quite another to communicate, or
absolutely,
or for management to unilaterally make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah. Thank you. You know what? I love the way this is taking us to, and responding to the question we have on the screen. Is it sustainable? It definitely is, and we definitely need to mind the gap. What's the gap? There's a very interesting organization that is called Edelman Communications. They do every single year a study that is called the Edelman Trust Barometer.
Right.
So they go out around the world just to find out how people think about trust in 4 different sets of organizations: government, media, not-for-profit organizations, and the 4th one is businesses. Interestingly, every single year, Edelman summarizes the results of this survey in one phrase. And the phrase for this year, 2022, is the cycle of distrust. So what Edelman is finding is that the entire world is living something that is the cycle of distrust, which is what I see as the gap. Now, interestingly, from the 4 sets of organizations, they analyze the one that people is trusting more, or I have sadly to say, distrusting less, is businesses. So what Edelman says is, it is in businesses where we have the opportunity of breaking the cycle of distrust to restore the cycle of trust. So I think that from the organizational perspective, this concept of divide and conquer, needs to have an objective in mind. And the objective is, how is it that I have to work as an organization to regain the trust I need from my market? And how is it that cybersecurity is going to be supporting this by following the execution of these tasks? And how is it that privacy needs to do the same following these tasks? So they need to divide and conquer, yes, but coordinated and defining who's going to be doing what. And I think that is what is going to be pushing the company through the concept of this modernized privacy that will deliver the value we are expecting. We have seen that one of the vehicles to demonstrate this commitment is sharing with markets. How is it that we are doing cyber in privacy in using tools, like the ESG reports? And when I say ESG, that stands for environmental, social, and governance. And these are the reports that show the commitment companies have on saying, this is how I am responding to the generation of controls to properly respond to environmental care. This is how is it that I am responding to social considerations. And this is how we are reinforcing governance to do what we have to do. But what I mean as well is that companies need to do this from a meaningful way and a clear way, not just copying templates from other reports on how is it that we are going to be doing this. And I think on that, on having companies representing or sharing these with the market through these vehicles, the markets and the community has the responsibility of pointing fingers to the companies that are not doing that the right way. But I think that the combination of these elements, breaking the cycle of distrust, dividing and conquering between the 2 of these initiatives or the 2 of these functions, and working in demonstrating value through these reports that are going to help break the cycle of distrust is what we can find as modernized privacy, making it sustainable.
I think that's brilliant. And it leads us elegantly into our next section. And we see that there's an evolution. If we understand anything about risk, is that there's an evolution in everything associated with it. Everything from emerging threats to the way that these CISO and CPO roles evolve to meet the requirements of compliance and those emerging threats. As we're about to lead towards Amalia's view of this, I know that she has some opinions about ESG and the benefits of ESG, and certainly about where these roles are going and what it's going to take to get there. My question is, how much friction is it going to take? And can we anticipate some of that friction going forward before we get to a steady state?
Well, I think the question of can you lead with privacy, I think we're starting to see more and more that the regulations that are coming in now are a lot stronger. In the United States, there's very strong regulation being enacted in Canada, and I'm hearing in our network that talking to my US colleagues, they're saying we are starting to change. We are starting to move the needle in the United States more towards people's rights to privacy, people's data protection rights. as the Europeans are saying. And that's the common divider and denominator is the technology, as we know, the big tech. We have, as Carlos said, an opportunity to go back to trust. We have to tame the big tech, and we have to allow privacy to take the lead, because privacy is about the context in which we use and we create value from personal information. And that nuance, it's like feelings. Feelings are not something that we can measure and put on a dashboard. We have to let privacy take the lead.
Rosario, what do you think about big tech, in particular within the context of the medical and healthcare fields? And do you see some of that friction or conflict that we talked about as we progress towards a steady state? And of course, I'm, from an accountability perspective, that's really where it comes in, because somebody's got to be responsible for this stuff.
Yeah, no, I do agree with everything Amalia just said, and I would add, I do think you have to lead with privacy, but I think we have some big gaps in respect of our regulations, where people are essentially uncertain of whether they can engage or not engage in particular types of projects. So I on the side, I assist or I speak with different scientists who have projects in the AI space. And there is so much, gray in terms of what they can and cannot do in respect of medical technology, in relation to algorithms, in relation to regulations, in relation to, the privacy principles that we all know are enshrined in our legislation. And so from that perspective, I think there really needs to be clarity in our privacy laws. And certainly, I think there needs to be alignment in our privacy laws across Canada. And this is, speaking from the Canadian perspective, provincially, with our substantially similar legislation and our PIPEDA, and even some of the private sector privacy legislation that is being discussed at the moment. So I do think you need to have that as a foundational piece, in addition to, of course, cybersecurity and the accountability to be there for both security and privacy. The other piece that I would add in terms of alignment is you certainly see in terms of collision, as soon as you have an incident and you have a cybersecurity incident of any kind, that's where you really have alignment with legal as well and privacy, right? Because it's you have a situation that certainly involves technology, but then you also need advisors on the legal side, on the privacy side, to assist with how you're going to limit the liability of a corporation who has been impacted, and so forth. And so I think you can really see how everybody has to work in alignment, and even in respect, for example, of privacy impact assessments or threat risk assessments, all of that ultimately can become evidence in any type of legal proceeding that does involve an incident. So I think you have to really ensure that you have alignment and ultimately accountability. Of course, that is accountability will give you the trust that you need.
Yeah. So that's fantastic. Pekka, just following up on this idea of technology as an enabler, do you think technology has the capacity to reduce that friction and to increase cooperation as the CPO, CISO roles evolve and take their positions within this accountability structure?
Could be. I mean, the privacy, some people find it as a newcomer in the whole realm of doing business and running public organizations and all of that. Technology could bring those roles together when many companies are now finally finding ways or realizing that they need to take care of their privacy compliance and data protection compliance, are now starting to look better technologies in to ensure that the information security will be materialized in the products and services, but also the privacy elements of their products and services will be realized. So obviously, there are popping up new kinds of privacy tech, privacy enhancing technologies out there in the market. Cybersecurity technologies have been there for many decades already now. So those PET, privacy enhancing technologies, have been starting to pop up just past decade in a higher intensity. But how the technology, it's interesting to see. What I like to I've been trying to see like what drives privacy forward, and I have been waiting for the consumer-driven privacy demand coming up, so that, for example, Apple has already tried to brand itself in the in the tech market, of the tech gadgets market, as the most privacy friendly company. So I'm still waiting for this surge in the consumer interest, and also for employee interest for that matter, that where are those products and services and working places where the privacy rights are being realized the best. That's something that we still need some more awareness to mature before we start to see true kinds of demand for privacy enhancing technologies to come. But I think this decade we will see a great surge in privacy technologies that are in line with information security technologies. Obviously, there's no privacy without information security, as has been stated before.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Carlos, moving to you and moving towards our last stretch, as a natural progression of our discussion here, I think we've all seen where this has been coming from. We talked about value, we talked about ROI. Ultimately, decisions have been made over the past decades based on, hey, what's the worst that can happen? Let's assign budgets there. Going forward, as the CISO CPO roles continue to evolve and hopefully towards that steady state, will there still be that much of a discussion about what's the worst that can possibly happen, and see that as a catalyst towards, as we say here, privacy being recognized as more of a team sport? What are your views?
Thank you. I think that the way we have seen the functions evolving has been more of a bottom-up approach instead of top-down. And what I mean by that is that we have cybersecurity trying to respond to the multiple challenges the company is having. We have privacy trying to respond to the multiple compliance considerations the company needs to be thinking of. And instead of that, I think that companies need to start bringing down what's the definition of success they have, what is it that they want to achieve, and start asking from a risk-based perspective, what are the things that can happen that will prevent the company from reaching that definition of success? And that needs to be very well linked with the values the company has, with what they want to project. I think that one of the elements that have prevented cybersecurity and privacy to be working together as a team is a lack of a definition of a common objective. And that's why I think that trust can be that vehicle. If the two of these business units, as other business units within the company, think that the company has one definition of success that incorporates trust into it, then we can think from these multiple departments, what can go wrong that can make my company to make stakeholders distrust the brand and distrust what we are doing? Because those are the situations that we have to be responding to. That's how we need to define controls in order to prevent, detect, or correct those situations from the privacy or the cybersecurity perspective. So I think this is where we need to start seeing this evolution in a definition of how these business units have to work, having a more top-down approach. This is where I want to go as an organization. Then these are the situations that can prevent me from reaching that definition of success. And these are the controls that I will be defining in order to reach this model. And I think that is going to be pushing cybersecurity and privacy to work more together in a common goal that may be the definition of trust for stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much. Rosario, I wanted to talk about your perception of what trust is and how that's a unifying factor in particularly in healthcare and medical, because it's such an interesting way to visualize risk. And then we'll go to Amalia for some closing comments. But Rosario, what's your feeling there? Will privacy be driving within that particular industry?
Yeah, I think trust is at the center of everything that we do in the healthcare system. Whether you have physicians that are regulated by their colleges to ensure that you trust the physicians and the nurses and other professionals that you go to for healthcare. Whether you have hospitals that are accredited so that you ensure that there is quality assurances when you go visit hospitals, and when patients go into the healthcare system, they have to be able to trust that their personal health information is going to be respected and treated securely. And so I think it's fundamental to have that trust in any system. Otherwise, you're going to have people who are not going to be, willing to get healthcare. So from my perspective, I think trust is central to the entire operation and the success of all the systems that we have in place. For us, because for ICS, for example, because the data that we collect is all voluntarily disclosed by data custodians, if we don't have our practices in respect of privacy or security or risk or audit or compliance or anything in place, why would any data custodian disclose their data voluntarily to ICS? It just wouldn't exist. And so we need to have everything in place and continually measure and demonstrate. And what the term we've been using this past year is to ensure that we have demonstrable accountability, to demonstrate with evidence that the controls we have in place are effective and we can measure those. And so we're building an audit program under our compliance program for that very fact. We're focusing on that this year.
Yeah. I agree. With respect to trust, it comes down to, is it verifiable or not? Is it understandable or not? Is it clear, coherent, etc.? Amalia, we've noticed over the past few years this increasing focus on the evolutionary driver that we call the RROCH test, the real risk of significant harm. And more recently, we've seen really cool research, most notably by Dr. Solovey and Citrin on privacy harms. Do you think privacy harms are going to drive the evolution of these professions going forward, drive them together, or perhaps increase friction? And will perhaps Canada's new upcoming fresh modern legislation make a dent in that friction?
I think the Quebec Bill 64, and it had so many different names, but the private sector privacy legislation coming up has gone to the core of how we're going to not just bridge the gap, but make organizations accountable and prove that privacy is a team sport. It puts the accountability on the CEO. The CEO is out of the gate accountable for privacy, and they can delegate internal or external. And then it's legal that has to interpret the law, but legal has to talk to a privacy professional to understand how to comply. Privacy professional has to do a PIA or many to work with security, and that has to involve the business because it's about creating business value. So I think building risk literate boards and privacy aware boards, it starts right from the legislation. Harm, I think, is going to start to take a positive connotation, as in, how do we prevent this from happening? And so is that positive side of risk that I think is going to start to be embedded in the cultures of organizations.
That's fantastic. I wanted to share with you some of the key words that I collected as we went through our presentation today. And sorry, we went over time a tiny bit. We're wrapping up. The keywords: compliance, authority, accountability, value, alignment, trust, an understanding of harm, and finally, we close the loop with legislation. So that's interesting from an evolutionary perspective, and that certainly has helped me understand better from your expertise where this industry is going, where the global state of privacy is going, and how that alignment between the security functions and the privacy functions are going to continue to evolve. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate everyone's input. We've got a few events coming up. I hope everyone keeps an eye out for these. Subscribe in order to get some of these notifications. These are free events. They're CPE eligible.
Can I say that on April 14th, actually, we have a topic and it's fantastic. And it's about the alignment around security safeguards from our colleagues in North America, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and the Quebec new privacy law that we keep talking about, and how security is a catalyst for actually better privacy. So don't miss that. It's a very interesting follow-on.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent extension to today's session, and certainly it's going to benefit perhaps the same audiences, perhaps complementary audiences. So thank you very much. And to continue the conversation, join us on LinkedIn. There's the PI PPC group. We invite you to join us there. Add your questions, add your discussion points, come and meet with our speakers there, and let's continue that conversation. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. It's been fascinating, not just for me, but to see all of our experienced speakers and panelists today. Thank you very much, all of you. I appreciate it.